welcome to the Texas Instruments OMAP 3530 and OMAP 3503 Developer Series, Module 3. We'll begin this module by examining the my-dsl package manager for the damn small Linux distribution. We will then use this package manager to download the source for the DSL kernel, which we will rebuild. And finally, we will install VMware tools. The next exercise we're going to do is to rebuild the DSL kernel. We're going to do this, one, just as an exercise, and then two, because we're going to need the kernel headers as well as the version of GCC that was originally used to build our kernel in order to rebuild the VMware tools so they can be installed. So first I'm going to go to the my-dsl package manager. I've already done a little research on the web and know that the kernel version I'm using was built with GCC 2.95. Also know that the DSL module for this is currently in the testing phase. But I can select it from testing and download. Now I also know that this module doesn't currently have a make utility. So I'm going to go to System and download the latest version of GCC. This GCC one with libs. That also comes with a make file. These have now been downloaded and installed. Now keep in mind that we first downloaded the GCC version 2.95 and then the latest version of GCC so that we could get the make file. So if I run GCC-V, you'll see that version 3.3.4 is the one that currently runs. If I do which GCC, it'll tell us that GCC is running out of user bin, and then we can do list-lsa user bin GCC. And you can see that there's a link. This is the way Linux commonly works. In order to handle versioning, there'll be an application name such as user bin GCC, but it'll actually be a link, the name with the version on it. So I can also list user bin GCC asterisk. And we do have two versions installed. Since 2.95 is what was actually used to build the kernel, I'm going to now route the older version 2.95 into user bin GCC. So I need to sudo remove, and then we can relink this. We're going to link user bin GCC now into user bin GCC-295. Oops, I did that backwards, so we need to do 2.95 into user bin GCC. Now if I run GCC-V, you'll see that I get the 2.95. Now that we have our GCC set up, we can download the kernel sources. If I start up Firefox, the bottom of the screen, in the Firefox browser, I just want to go back to the same website where I downloaded DSL to begin with. That was from download small Linux, this location. Click on the download link, and I'm going to select this first mirror from the list. Now we got the kernel originally from the current directory. If I go down to kernel, there's a tar gzip that has the kernel source. I'll download this first. Once the kernel's done, we're also going to want to download this file, dsl.config. This is the configuration file that was originally used to build the kernel. Now that that's done, go to the home directory, and you'll notice that these files are there. I'm going to copy these files both into, actually I'm going to use the move utility, we don't need them in this location anymore, to user source. First we need to make that directory. Then we can move both these files into user source. Then I'm going to change into the user source directory. Both files are there. Use tar with ZXF options to unpack the Linux tarball. Now, if you have experience building a Linux kernel previously, you probably know that the current configuration details are saved in a file called .config, which is stored in the same directory as the top-level make file, which is the top level of the archive. What we need to do is copy this dsl.config into that Linux 2.4 directory, but under the name .config. I can now change into the Linux directory and run sudo make old config. What that's going to do is it's going to go into that .config file and set everything up according to what's written in that configuration. We can sudo make dep for make dependencies. And we're now ready to rebuild the kernel. So before we do that, let's just double check the version. Again, it's 2.95, which is the version that was originally used to build this kernel. So now I can sudo make, and this will rebuild the kernel. Takes a moment. So now the kernel build's complete. Of course, we didn't change any of the configuration options, so this is exactly the same kernel that we had previously, but if you ever do need to rebuild the kernel, that would be the procedure. More importantly, we now have everything that we need in order to rebuild the VMware tools. So I'm going to go back to the home directory. Hit Control-Alt to get out of full screen mode. Go to VM and install VMware tools. Now, normally what VMware does is it will present the tools install files into the virtual machine as an ISO mounted into the CD-ROM drive, which is what it's done in this case. And normally it would be auto-detected, but DSL is having a problem auto-detecting the CD. So we might try to just manually mount the CD-ROM into the file system. We'll need root permissions to do that. Normally an IDE drive CD-ROM would be in dev HDC. We specify the type of the file system, which is ISO 9660 for a CD-ROM, and then say that we're going to mount it into the CD-ROM point. If we do this now, we get a very helpful message from Linux, which tells us that this might be an IDE device where we actually use one of these other device nodes. It turns out SR0 will work for us. So now we've mounted, we can double check that by listing the contents of CD-ROM, and you see we've now correctly mounted the tools. So now I can just copy. By the way, there's two files here, a Red Hat Package Manager file and a tar gzip. They both have the same contents. I'm going to copy the tar gzip, and then we can use the tar utility with the ZXF options to unpack the tarball. And you'll see that there's a Perl script called VMware install. You're going to need to run this under root permission. And this is a funny thing. It's because of the sudo command, it's having path problems. So I'm going to do sudo and then manually put in $PWD. That stands for print working directory. What that'll do is insert the full path to the current directory. Then I can put VMware install.pl. This time it finds it. You can just hit enter in order to specify the defaults on each of these. And the tools are now rebuilt.